Hi, everybody. Greg suggested that I share the presentation that I gave last week at Northwestern University, which was a conference with CMOs, their analytic leads, academics, all about whether or not brand advertising works and how to measure it and how do we know if it works. So this is the presentation I gave, which is our learnings from millions of consumer IDs that have been analyzed through Brandis Performance and our movable middle work. So the first thing is the real question that's going on here is that CFOs are constantly challenging brand advertising. They think of it as a wasteful expense, and our evidence actually is that they're right. The You we see marketers wasting up to 95% of their advertising. That is where it doesn't return uh, even a dollar of revenue per dollar, or maybe it returns as much as $2 of revenue per dollar of advertising, but that's still kind of underwater. The thing is, while brand advertising campaigns can be very wasteful, the CFOs actually have the wrong suspect in custody. It isn't the brand creative or the brand advertising per se that is the problem. The problem is bad media allocation. From movable middle theory, we know that low loyals, who are the great majority of consumers with respect to any normal size brand, they can be 80 or 90% of consumers even. We know that low loyals are extremely unresponsive to advertising. We know that the response basically comes from movable middles and a little bit from brand loyals, but while they're into your brand, they just don't have a lot of room to grow. So here's the problem. Brand marketers tend to have a bifurcated media strategy. They tend to use very broad reach, upper funnel types of advertising when they're thinking about building brand favorability. And then they turn on all kinds of optimizers and machine learning and pixels when they're thinking performance. So, how do you know if it's the creative that's the problem with brand marketing, or is it possibly the media strategy? So, what we've identified is the culprit is actually much more likely to be the media strategy. So, the way we identified this is by segmenting consumers in a different way. We don't segment them based on heavy, medium, light, or personas, or lifetime value, or demos, or even machine learning. Our approach with the movable middle framework is to segment consumers based on their probability of choosing the brand of interest, given that they're going to buy the category. So, what's the likelihood that they choose you? And it turns out that approach brings in a whole bunch of really powerful math that really represents a whole new science for brand growth. So that was the key unlock was probability of choice. Now, why are those low loyals? That's 70 or 80%. Why are those low loyals not not only are they not buying you, they don't pay attention to your advertising. Why don't they pay attention to the advertising? So I'm sure many of you who are watching this video have seen the video of teenagers bouncing basketballs, and some have black shirts and some have white shirts. And you're asked to count the number of times that the team with the white shirts has passed the basketball. And it's a very chaotic scene. They're moving, they're bouncing basketballs, and it takes a lot of concentration to count how many times they're touching the basketballs. And in the middle of the video, someone walks out in a gorilla suit. And very few people see the gorilla, basically, what happens. I could tell you, I was at a management conference for the company I used to work for. There were 30 of us in the room, and only three people of the 30 saw the gorilla. I did not see the gorilla. I couldn't even believe it was the same video, but it was. And it's the principle of inattentional blindness, which comes from cognitive psychology. You're so focused on a task that you kind of like just filter out with blinders everything else that's going on around you. So the what's going on here is for low loyals who've made their choices that they will consider or prefer other brands, and you're not in the in the consideration set. For those consumers, you are the gorilla. They don't see you, they don't think of you, they don't see your advertising, so they can't respond to it. So that's basically the problem. You are the gorilla. So the low loyals really are not going to respond to any profitable degree to advertising. So if marketers are, when they have brand campaigns, they're always going very broad, which means 70 or 80% of their ad budget is going against these low loyals who don't care at all about the brand and will not respond to its advertising. The waste for brand campaigns comes from that false equivalence that for brand advertising, you need to go very broad. That's the problem. It's the media strategy. Now, that was the theory, and we developed this based on theory. It's really in marketing, very often people use inductive reasoning. That is, they do a bunch of experiments and they then try and figure out patterns from all the experiments, say, what's going on here? Okay. Deductive reasoning is you start with a theory, you start with a hypothesis, and then you get into a testing phase. So, movable middles and Brandon's performance were all deductive. They were theory driven that then got proven through the testing we did. So, for movable middles, we now have 12 case studies and you can see how much more responsive movable middles are versus low loyals. That's what these multipliers are. So for Kroger, for example, movable middles were 8.3 times more responsive than low loyals. For Ally, it was as high as 23x. This is not 8.3%. This is 830% more responsive. So we're talking about really a big upside if through targeting you move a certain portion of the money that otherwise would go to low loyals, move it over towards movable middles. So what we identify here is that yes, there's ad waste, but brand advertising is not the cause. It's the wrong suspect in custody. And so brand advertising is acquitted of the crime of ad waste. Well, then if it's acquitted of that crime, is it possible that actually it's the hero of some story? And we believe that it is. So when we did our brand's performance testing on Kroger, which was the leading grocery retailer in the US, what we identified was the power of favorability. We analyzed 400,000 shoppers. We studied them well past the end of the campaign for a total of 10 months using our brand's performance methodology, which is really kind of like a single source methodology in that we have surveys, ad serving, and conversion data all on the same IDs, which are persistent IDs, so we can track them over time. Now, what did we see that was so amazing in the Kroger study? What we saw was that their business with respect to online ordering, the focus was actually not brick and mortar sales. It was ordering from Kroger online to be delivered to the home or to be picked up in the parking spot. And what we saw was that the after the campaign ended and we tracked sales for the post period, we found that there was 6 times more incremental sales occurring after the advertising ended. Now, nothing in the literature says you should see a 6x multiplier of long-term sales versus short-term sales. So, where do you see this 6x lift that would go unnoticed using normal methods? But Brandon's performance picked this up using frequent shopper data. Where did this come from? What caused this? Well, it turns out that we tracked through the surveys a 6 point lift in brand favorability. So 6 points is a big move for brand favorability, but in an absolute sense, 6 points doesn't sound like a lot. So how can 6 points movement in a metric lead to 6x? So 6 points, 6x. How could that translate into 6 times the sales rate after the campaign ended? Well, it turns out favorability is extremely powerful. Non-customers who are favorable to your brand, and there's a lot of them, they convert at 3 times higher the rate. So your rate of capture of a non-customer into being a customer is 3 times higher. Secondly, we saw that favorable customers were retained at higher rates, and in any given quarter, they spent more. So they had higher sales rates. The final piece is that this advantage of three times the capture rate among non-customers who are favorable versus unfavorable, that pattern persists for a long time. It turns out that brand favorability really lasts for a long time, like more than a year. So they might not remember the ad that made them favorable, but they remember their feelings about the brand. So the fact that brand favorability persists means that each and every quarter you get this 3x benefit. So it's a benefit that compounds. Now, we went back and we looked at Campbell Soup and Ally, and we saw very similar patterns for those brands as well. So this is an expected pattern. Now, they didn't have a 6 point lift in brand favorability, but the idea that favorability lasts for a long time, that favorables are much more likely to convert than non-favorables, those are the recurring patterns that we see. Okay, so where are we in terms of what we've learned? Well, we're moving now towards a new science for brand growth. Can brand advertising be a wasteful expense? Yes, but much of that waste is actually avoidable. The problem is not the creative, it's the bad targeting that tends to get coupled with brand campaigns. It's the idea of going broad, going upper funnel that is where the waste is largely coming from. Um, the key here in brand favorability is especially acute among non-customers because of this capture rate. And because of this, math can be used to actually quantify what is the advantage of brand building. Now, to my knowledge, no one has really generated a quantitative structure for saying, like, what is more brand equity worth? What is more favorability to a brand worth? It tends to be two different worlds of measurement. You use surveys and you look at brand metrics, or you look at conversion data or sales data. And no one has really brought those two things together until we created the brand as performance methodology. But as powerful as these observations or findings are, there's one more big idea that I want to share with all of you, and that is it's all connected. And that was a most recent discovery that is really kind of like a rock your world discovery for the world of media planning. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, marketers have very different ideas about how to structure a brand campaign versus a performance campaign. They're almost oppositional. You do this whole set of things if you're trying to drive brand, and you do this other set of things if you're just trying to drive short-term sales. But it turns out they're not oppositional. That it turns out we were able to use math to bring these two goals together. And what we found was that the audiences you should target, the audiences you construct via lookalike modeling, or the audiences you seek out more than others for performance are actually the exact same audiences you should seek out for building brand favorability. They're pretty much the same. That's not what marketers are currently doing, and that's what leads to this bad rap that brand advertising has, that it's an expense, it doesn't deliver anything. Wrong. Brand advertising using the right kinds of media allocation plans will actually generate both brand lift and sales. Now, how do we get there? Well, we know from math and from calculus. And by the way, I have some math charts at the end of this that I'm going to share, but I put them at the end because I wanted to try and get through this in 15 minutes or 20 minutes at the most, give you the main ideas. But if you're willing to stick with me, I'll get a little bit more into the math at the very end. But it turns out from math, we know when two outcomes like favorability and sales, if they're related to the same variable, then you can relate their rates of change to each other. It's using something called the chain rule in calculus. Okay. So, what is the linkage? Well, baseline probability of choice. People who have a higher probability of choosing your brand, we know that they're more favorable. The people who have like a zero probability or a 10% probability of choosing your brand, like they give you 0 points or 1 point in a 10-point constant sum, the favorability levels among them are very low. We measure that and we know they're low. And then we see what that curve looks like. Well, it turns out you can build a highly predictive equation from looking at those patterns. But we also know from movable middle theory that the probability somebody has of choosing your brand also determines their responsiveness to advertising. Remember those low loyals that are not responsive to your advertising? Well, they have a low baseline probability of choosing you. They have low responsiveness in terms of sales. So we can link together favorability response and sales response. Um, And by doing that, we're able to generate the following curves. Now, the orange line is the expected responsiveness to advertising in terms of brand lift, building brand favorability. And the green line is the expected response in terms of sales. Now, the x-axis is the baseline probability that that consumer would choose your brand given a purchase. It goes from 0 to 100%. Um, what we see here is a couple of very interesting patterns. First of all, the favorability response peaks a little bit sooner. It peaks around 25-30% probability of choice, whereas the sales response peaks at 50%. So the curves are a little bit different, but there are some similarities. Both peaks exist inside the movable middle range, the 20 to 80% probability of choice range. So when you have audiences that have more movable middles, you're going to pick up both peaks, the peak of responsiveness in terms of brand lift, the peak of responsiveness in terms of sales lift. The other thing that's in common are what I'm calling dead zones. Down at the 0 to 5% range on the x-axis, where people have almost no chance of choosing your brand, they have no probability of responding, very little probability of responding in terms of sales. They also have a really low probability of responding in terms of thinking more favorably about your brand. It's a dead zone. Advertising to those people will be extremely unproductive. And the other thing is over 50% of consumers towards a typical brand are actually in that dead zone. So again, when you use broad reach, you're directing randomly 50% or more of your ad impressions into a dead zone that is really preordained to not be productive. So through targeting, we can improve those odds. Um, Now, when we came up with this idea of dead zones, we saw it in the Campbell's research, and then we went back to the Allied data and the Kroger data, and sure enough, we saw the same thing. That people who gave, say, 0 points in the constant sum exercise, there was no lift in favorability. There was no lift in sales from those people. So the dead zone concept was validated. Now, there's also a dead zone at the upper end, but there aren't a lot of people there. So, targeting advertising the people who have a 90-95% probability of choosing you, doesn't make a lot of sense because they have nowhere to go. They can only go to 100. So we have two dead zones. But what happens is that when you build audiences that have a higher than national average percentage of the audience that's in the movable middles, it takes people away from the dead zones. There's more movable middles, so there's smaller dead zones. So when you build audiences that have twice the national average or three times the national average of movable middles, you are inherently that also reduces the size of the dead zones. So you are minimizing the ad waste that would otherwise occur through broad reach. So this strategy works for sales, performance. It also works for brand lift. Now, that's not to say that you just because the targeting strategy could very well be the same, whether you have a brand campaign or a performance campaign, that doesn't mean everything is the same. So we think of effectiveness of advertising as a three-legged stool. There's the creative, the channel partners, the channel and the partners that you choose, and then there's targeting. What we've done here is we've focused on the targeting leg because that was the leg of the stool that was least well understood. But that doesn't mean just because you target the same audiences that you would use the same creative or the same, ad units or tactics or partners. So those things can all be different. Me personally, my expectation is that video would work better for brand and display might work better for performance, but you're still taking that advertising and targeting it to the same consumers, or you should, the same segments that are designed to be hyper responsive to sales. And it turns out they're also hyper responsive in terms of favorability. So I'd like you to imagine a world where advertising just works a lot better. Imagine that advertising could work 50 to 100% better than it does today, really by following the math. And you can prove that brand marketing really generates returns, business returns, not just presenting, well, the CFO asks, how do you know the brand marketing work? Well, look at our ad awareness. Well, you can't take ad awareness to the bank, right? You need to show sales. It's cost of entry for advertising at this point, and you can do it. The point is that if you get the targeting right for brand campaigns and performance, you will demonstrate that the advertising was productive. Imagine that the whole ecosystem understood this. They'd all be playing by a new set of rules. It makes sense to marketers, to CFOs, to ad tech platforms, and to media agencies. In this world, when advertising works better, everyone wins. Okay. Now, how do you get there? Well, some of you might have seen the movie The Martian with Matt Damon, where they landed on Mars and they thought he was dead because he got hit by a rock and it cracked the visor on his suit. And it turned out he wasn't dead. Well, but how was he going to live when he had like 1 month of food, but it would be a year or more for them to be able to come back and get him? And he said, I'm going to have to science the shit out of this. To make advertising work better than it currently works, to make brand marketing clearly be a star as opposed to an expense, and to have the organization see it that way, you're going to have to use science. And that's what this is all about. So that gives you the main idea. That's the main part of this presentation. But I do have a couple more math-oriented slides. So for those of you who want to dig a little bit deeper into why we have these results, I'm happy to do that. So the first point is when I said that 6 points of favorability could generate this huge future annuity of incremental sales, the way we uh, understand that and quantify it is by using a Markov matrix approach. So what that is it's a transition set of transition probabilities from what your status was in the prior cycle to what happens in the next cycle. So these numbers are a little bit disguised because it's proprietary to Kroger, but they give the correct characterization. So let's say that, as I said before, favorable non-customers have 3 times the probability of becoming customers versus non-favorables. That's the zero point zero 0.06 versus zero point zero 0.02. 3 times, 6% versus 2% is the rate of capture, irrespective of advertising. This is just the baseline rate of winning them because they're favorable, even though they're not yet customers. Now, if they become customers, then you have a 90% probability of retaining them. So you see that this isn't a one and done kind of an advantage because once they move into the customer state, then you retain them as customers at a really high rate. And the final point is that favorability lasts for a long time. So when you have a favorable non-customer, in addition to a 6% chance that they become a customer by the next quarterly cycle, there's also an 80% probability that they stay favorable. So each and every quarter, they are producing for you this 3x advantage. Eventually, that zero point 0.8 times zero point 0.8 times zero point 0.8 evaporates. But if you work out the math, it really lasts for a long time. It lasts, you're achieving advantage from advertising well beyond a year from when the ad campaign was run. So the Markov matrix really helped us to calculate what the advantage was of these 6 points of favorability that Kroger was able to generate incrementally. So that's one element of the math. The second element of the math is that I used a trick. It's a trick that actually Einstein used in special relativity, which is instead of just having simple x and y axes, each axis is a function. The x-axis is the expected responsiveness to advertising exposure in terms of sales conversions. The y-axis is the expected responsiveness in terms of lift and favorability. Okay. Now, what I then did was I said, well, both of these, as I said before, are related to the baseline probability of choice. Okay. So when you have an audience that reflects the brand nationally, which is what a broad reach media plan basically is, it's everybody's in the audience and it's the national percentage. So here's an example of a brand that has a 10% share. 13% of consumers are movable middles. And then we trace across uh, to the y-axis, and we see that we're only about halfway towards the best possible outcome in responsiveness in terms of brand lift. We trace down to the x-axis, and we see we're only about a fifth of the way towards the best possible outcome from the ad dollars in terms of sales response. Now, what happens when you build an audience that is more movable middle than the national average? Let's say 19% or 25% or 30% movable middles. What you see what's happening is both things are going up almost at a 45-degree angle together. So as you get audiences that have higher and higher concentrations of movable middles, up to about 37 to 40%, up to about this point here, when you have more and more movable middles concentration in the audience, you get both more sales response and more favorability response. So they're not oppositional. They go together. And targeting is your friend. It's not your enemy when it comes to brand marketing. And once marketers realize this, then they're going to be able to demonstrate to CFOs how brand advertising works. It works to generate sales, and we saw that it works to generate an annuity of future performance. Now, the other thing about this chart is as you as you build audiences where you have a higher market share, okay, what happens is more market share, even more market share, even more market share, which is the coding, the color coding here. You see that as you build more market share, your movable middle keeps going up and up until you get over here. Then what happens is when you hit about a 50% share, which I mean, no brand, very few brands have that. But I mean, if you build an audience from first party data, you might be able to build an audience that where you have a 50% share of their purchasing or even more. What happens is once you get past 50%, the movable middle starts getting smaller again. You see that, for example, over here, the national average for the brand is a 10% share. That gives it a 13% movable middles. But over here, it has about a 90% share. So it's really like the best customers of the brand. And you're back to a 13% movable middle. So the relationship of lift is really a loop that if you keep building an audience to be more and more favorable, giving you more and more of their purchases past a certain point, it starts curving back around, and up to a certain point it's good, and then past a certain point you start getting less and less yield. If you want to think about it logically, again, if you have an audience you've created where your brand has, say, a 90% market share, there's nowhere to go. They're all favorable, and you already have 90% of their purchases, so it's very hard to get much more of that. If you have a 10 share and 13% movable middles, there's a lot of people there who don't care about your brand. So again, you don't have a lot of responsiveness. So anyway, so that's the way this particular graph works. So this is guidance for what is optimal in building audiences using lookalike modeling. So I just wanted to show this to you. Again, it's a little math oriented. I know there's a way of explaining it a little bit more clearly, but in the capabilities we're building, where we take seed samples of movable middles and then we build audiences at scale of movable middles. You could build a smaller audience that has a really high percent of movable middles, or you could build a little larger scale audience and the movable middle percent is less. This suggests what that trade-off is going to look like. That past a certain point, more movable middles but at less scale is not the best strategy. So there is a quantitative way of solving this problem. Anyway, as I said, this was the more math part of it. I hope all of this made sense to you guys. Um, so thanks for the time that you put in to watch the video. And any questions, you can always reach out to me via email. Thank you.